Live from New York,
Greetings and salutations, guys. Eric here with my review of Saturday Night. Not quite Saturday Night Live Origins, but hyper-focused movie about the 90 minutes behind the scenes leading into the debut of the first episode of SNL. Gabriel LaBelle stars as Lorne Michaels, the creator of the show, trying desperately to bring together a ton of chaotic elements to actually pull this thing off, even as the deck feels completely stacked against him. The thing about Saturday Night is, if you take a step back, it's kind of a ridiculous movie. I mean, I'm sure behind the scenes, the 90 minutes leading up to SNL's debut were very tense and fraught and eventful, but were they this insane? Did this many things happen in those 90 minutes? That feels pretty dubious. Stuff like last-minute rewrites or the final decisions on what was going to make it into the show or be cut, sure, that makes sense. But the idea that this many huge events are happening stacked right on top of each other, from multiple deliveries that are crucial to the show, to meetings with network executives, to a pivotal behind-the-scenes hire, that they were all jumbled up right then and there, that is pretty obviously artifice. That doesn't mean that it's not entertaining artifice, and I will say that Saturday Night is a very watchable, often very enjoyable movie. Co-writer and director Jason Reitman uses everything from long takes to fast-moving whip pans to convey energy and excitement and that tension in the lead up to the premiere, even as it can't help but feel like a very skewed version of what actually happened. Now, pretty much any biopic or any based on true events movie is going to change things and alter things. This one just feels a little more egregious with what it's doing. It works better if you view Saturday Night as this almost mythical take on a show that certainly does have its own mythology around it at this point. SNL is kicking off its 50th season the same weekend this movie opens, which is pretty insane. Obviously, everyone is not going to be a fan of SNL, and there are going to be people who say, well, the show sucks now, or the show has sucked for several years, or the show has always sucked. But I do think you have to kind of acknowledge the pop culture impact of SNL, no matter what you think of the series itself, because there's been so many sketches and so many characters that have kind of broken out into the mainstream, but also just the insane amount of big actors who got their start on SNL is pretty astounding. And Saturday Night does serve to remind you that it is also astounding how many notable names, only a couple of whom were established, were inside 30 Rock the night of the premiere. From Michaels himself to the entire original cast to people like George Carlin, Jim Henson, Andy Kaufman, and Billy Crystal. This is Jason Reitman's first movie as a director since Ghostbusters Afterlife, although he did co-write and produce Ghostbusters Frozen Empire earlier this year. It seems like an odd time for him as a filmmaker because he's made plenty of good movies. He's also made some movies that didn't work, but right now he seems extremely reverent about his late father, Ivan Reitman, and Ivan Reitman's colleagues and friends, many of whom are depicted in Saturday Night. In the movie, Michaels is shown speaking about his sketch comedy show in rather grandiose terms, giving these mini speeches about what it represents. And even though a couple of the other characters are sort of mocking him for it, it definitely feels like Reitman is on the side of the Lorne character. And again, I think SNL is a very important part of pop culture history, and I'd even say American history, but I also think the movie's kind of laying it on pretty thick. The cast, though, are really strong, starting with LaBelle and Cooper Hoffman, who plays Dick Ebersol, who spends much of the film at Lorne's side. Reitman made an interesting choice here, casting two notably young actors, both of whom are around 20, to play guys who were about a decade older at the time. It accentuates even further that SNL was about a new, young generation coming in to upset the apple cart in network TV, and I think it works pretty well, since both actors commit to the point that you feel they're youthful, but not like they're high school kids pretending to be adults. Also, as a big fan of both The Fabelmans and Licorice Pizza, it's pretty cool to see Sammy Fabelman and Gary Valentine in charge of Saturday Night Live. Other standouts among the huge cast include Corey Michael Smith as Chevy Chase, Dylan O'Brien as Dan Aykroyd, Ella Hunt as Gilda Radner, and recent Emmy winner Lamorne Morris as Garrett Morris, no relation, all of whom do a very good job of evoking the famous people they're playing, even when, as in the case of Hunt, they don't really resemble that actor physically. I do wish the female SNL cast members were given more to do, though. While Chevy and Garrett get a substantial amount of screen time and their own sort of mini arcs, and Gilda's ability to pretty much charm anyone is used as a through line, Kim Matula's Jane Curtin, and especially Emily Farron's Lorraine Newman feel pretty lost in the shuffle. Then there's Matt Wood's John Belushi, who gets a bigger focus as Belushi waffles on signing his contract and pushes back against nearly everything asked of him, but without Wood quite capturing the specific, one-of-a-kind energy Belushi conveyed. Away from the main SNL cast, Rachel Sennett is very funny as writer Rosie Schuster, whose marriage to Michaels adds tension to their work dynamic, and a scene-stealing Tommy Dewey really shines as SNL head writer Michael O'Donoghue, with Dewey perfectly conveying O'Donoghue's darkly funny, brash approach to pretty much everything and everyone he encounters. There are several moments in Saturday Night where you can kind of feel the manipulation happening, but sometimes you can still kind of give into it. There's one scene, for instance, where Gilda Radner is talking to John Belushi, and she starts talking about what their future can be, and I started to scoff inside because I'm like, I know what you're doing here, which is you're having a scene between the two people that are destined to die young. And it's kind of obvious. On the other hand, it kind of works too. I did feel sad because I thought the performances were good, and also because it sucks that we lost these two brilliantly talented people so young. Basically, you have to decide if you can go with what Saturday Night is doing. For instance, Chevy Chase is famously egotistical, and that only amplified during SNL's first season as he became the first breakout star. But do I believe in the hour before showtime, network executives were already taking him aside to talk about future plans? Of course not. Garrett Morris has spoken about feeling out of place both as SNL's oldest cast member and the only person of color, but did he spend the time right before the premiere trying to get Michaels to tell him what his role was supposed to be on the show? That feels pretty doubtful. A lot of moments are being conflated here and kind of being plucked from the future of the show, such as having J.K. Simmons pop by as Milton Berle, showing the generation gap between his old school comedy and SNL's new school comedy, which would lead to some very real-life tensions when Berle actually hosted the show, but that didn't happen until season 4 in 1979. Nothing like this was occurring the night of the first episode, since Milton Berle most definitely wasn't inside 30 Rock on a Saturday night filming some random variety show as depicted in the movie. Sequences like this lead to the movie often feeling silly and sometimes very false, and yet there are other scenes that really work. It's a weird blend. And yeah, some of it's kind of exasperating. Jim Henson, who's played by Nicholas Braun, who also plays Andy Kaufman, is basically used as this sort of silly nerd who takes his puppets way too seriously while the SNL staff all scoff at him. And yeah, I get it. You could argue that this is basically using shorthand to show the SNL crew's point of view of Henson at the time, but also it's Jim freaking Henson. Show some respect. Similarly, SNL's very first host, George Carlin, is basically just depicted as a raging a-hole here, despite Carlin's well-earned legendary status, though Matthew Rhys puts his past on the Americans to good use, becoming pretty damn hard to recognize under that wig and under that beard as Carlin. I also have to note that Nicholas Podany does a rather uncanny impersonation of Billy Crystal, who was supposed to have a stand-up bit on SNL's premiere, but got cut at the last minute. Still, it does feel odd that we spend a lot of screen time with Crystal versus, say, Lorraine Newman. I'm one of those people who actually is pretty fascinated by Saturday Night Live, both as an institution, but also how the show is made. And I've read a bunch of the behind-the-scenes books and a bunch of the oral histories, and I love to read about all the different cast upheavals and all the drama behind the scenes and everything it took to first get the show launched, but then to keep it on the air, and how many times it came close to being canceled and how many actors hated each other. I love all that. Does Saturday Night feel like the definitive fictional take on this story as a film? Not really. It's more of this sort of big mashup representation of not just SNL's first night, but kind of its first couple of years, given how much from the future is evoked or referenced here. But if you're an SNL fan, or certainly an SNL aficionado, it's worth checking out. If you can accept that it comes with what doesn't feel like one grain of salt, but, many grains of salt. Mostly because this movie's very existence now becomes part of the narrative of SNL's wild ride through the years, and how it keeps impacting TV and film, down to the fact that we can now say, wow, they made a feature film about the first night of SNL. Isn't that crazy? So those are my thoughts on Saturday Night, which is a mixed bag of a movie to be sure, but one that is still entertaining. So it will be in theaters this weekend, but just limited release in LA, New York, and Toronto. It goes wider a couple weeks after that. So if you can like and subscribe and hit the bell and all that fun stuff, that would be excellent, and I'll be back with more. Thanks, guys.